In this episode, we talk about a murder, a police chase, and an escape. We also talk about India winning more than 100 medals in the Asian Games. But first, we talk about the terror charges under UAPA against the NewsClick founder Prabir Purkayastha. Hi, I'm Rahel Philipose, and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Last Tuesday, the Delhi Police Special Cell, invoking stringent terror charges under the UAPA, arrested Prabir Purkayastha, the founder and editor-in-chief of NewsClick, along with Amit Chakravarti, the head of its HR department. As part of the investigation, the police also conducted raids at more than 50 locations connected to the news portal. Now, on Friday, the media gained access to the FIR against Purkayastha, which reveals alarming details about the case. It turns out that, among other things, the critical reportage by NewsClick against the government is being considered terrorism under the current charges. To learn more about the allegations and the concerns they raise, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to Apurva Vishwanath of the Indian Express in this segment.
Apurva, we know that NewsClick has been under the scanner since 2018, and the Delhi Police's case against NewsClick is in a way based on the Enforcement Directorate's case against it. Could you remind our listeners what that case is about?
So the Enforcement Directorate's case is essentially looking into the source of funding of NewsClick. Where does the money come from and who is it distributed to? So there are potential foreign exchange violations, allegations of money laundering, and these are the things that the Enforcement Directorate is investigating. So what is new in this FIR that we've only had access to on Friday is the terror angle. So in this FIR, there are a motley of allegations, from Naxalites to ISI agent to China, and a bunch of connections have been drawn by the Delhi police. But the crucial thing to know is that the source of funding mixed with critical reportage, especially against the government, is being defined as terrorism under the UAPA.
And Apurva, what specific instances of reportage does the FIR cite?
So the FIR draws this connection between the source of funding and details some reportage of NewsClick to say that they intended to strike terror and were also raising funds for terrorist activity. So there are broadly three issues that they have with the reportage of NewsClick. One is that the FIR says that there were secret inputs which reveal on email that Neville Roy Singham's company and Prabir Purkayastha exchanged to show the intent that NewsClick intended to show Kashmir and Arunachal Pradesh as not part of India. So this is one aspect that they bring up. The second is, they talk about a conspiracy to disrupt supplies and services essential to the life of community in India. This is a conspiracy to quote unquote protract the farmers' protests. The third is, of course, a conspiracy to route funds from China and for paid news that quote intentionally peddled news criticizing domestic policies. Here they talk about, false narratives against domestic pharma companies during COVID and undermining the efforts of democratically elected Indian government. And of course, all of these words, from anti-national to anti-Indian, these words are liberally thrown around in the FIR.
And Apurva, you mentioned this term disruption of supplies and services. Basically, the FIR says that NewsClick conspired to disrupt supplies and services essential to the life of community in India and abet damage and destruction of property by protraction of farmers' protests. And now this phrase, disruption of supplies and services, is mentioned in the UAP Act. Can you tell us in what context it comes up?
Yeah, so this phrase, disrupting supplies and services essential to the community of India, this you will find in Section 15 in the UAPA. Section 15 is the provision that defines what is a terrorist act, right? And if you look at the provision, Section 15(1)(a) starts by saying anybody using bombs and similar such hazardous substances, lethal substances, which would be dynamite or, things like that. And in that, there is a subclause, which is subclause 3, which says using those means causes disruption of services. So to make this charge, for our readers, think disrupting maybe a power grid in a major city, right? Or blowing up a highway. These are some of the examples I can think of to define the seriousness of allegations like this. It wouldn't be by any stretch, stopping a few trucks at the border because of a protest, right? And what is very important to note is this FIR does not talk about any violent methods at all. It is at best drawing a link between taking money from China and reporting critically about the Indian government. But there is no mention of a violent means to attack the sovereignty of India or overthrow a democratically elected government or any such thing. And what is important is, Shashank, similar FIRs, which against farmers and against protesters that surfaced during the protests for blocking of the streets, right? Blocking of the highway. Those have been withdrawn. The government said in the Rajya Sabha that these FIRs, about 89 of them were withdrawn. So to make that charge and raise it to the level of terrorism is really stretching it, even if you want to take a very strict definition of terrorism.
And Apurva, this is something we've talked about in the past as well, that when invoking such terror charges, it is important to show the intent to strike terror. Do we get a sense of that in this FIR?
So not in the FIR. The only evidence of any intent is that the FIR says they received secret inputs, that on email, Purkayastha and Neville Roy Singham's company talked about putting out a map of India without Arunachal Pradesh and Kashmir. Apart from this, there is no larger design and conspiracy that is outlined in the FIR, which is why I'm assuming the strenuous links have been drawn to anti-national, Naxal, ISI agent, all of these things. But the problem is really that in UAPA, the framework of that legislation puts the accused and the state at a very unequal footing. Maybe this conversation about intent will surface in the trial. But when a judge is looking at bail, when a judge is looking at extending the remand, there is really nothing that the accused can do but to take up the burden of proof and say none of these charges can be proven. So when you shift that onus of burden of proof, it really works against the accused.
Okay, so the most concerning aspect of this FIR is obviously that critical reportage against the government is being considered terrorism. And right now, the question that a lot of people have is that could terror charges also be invoked against other news organizations who have been critical of the government? So is that a valid concern, or is the NewsClick case unique because here there are also questions about its source of funding and allegations of money laundering?
So a plain reading, of course, says that linking the source of funding, which the government deems is questionable, with critical reportage is the NewsClick's case. But while that source of funding is still being looked at, a clubbing in critical reportage is very alarming, is very problematic. It's not just Prabir Purkayastha or NewsClick, but it has larger ramifications for press freedom, free speech, especially when there are no credible instances of whether there was false reporting, whether there was reporting which was intently malicious, none of that. It's a set of amorphous allegations that you criticize the government without any details. So that is the problem really. It's not so much about looking into the source of funding, which the government is doing under the money laundering probe that is happening. But that money laundering probe now is equated to raising funds for terrorism. That link is what is very disturbing.
And Apurva, at this time, do we know what NewsClick has said about these allegations and what we have heard from the founder about it?
So NewsClick late on Friday issued a statement and said these allegations are absurd and it is a blatant attempt to muzzle free speech and independent press in India. And NewsClick has also said that apart from the allegations in the FIR being quote-unquote untenable and bogus, they have time and again cooperated with investigation by 3 agencies, the Enforcement Directorate, the Economic Offences Wing, the Delhi Police, and the Income Tax Department. So while none of those investigations have led to any charge sheets, what you have now is a terror charge.
And next we talk about a murder and an escape that puts most movie plots to shame. Earlier this month, the police in Gujarat arrested 47-year-old Tarun Jinaraj, a former basketball coach turned recovery manager with a tech company, who's accused of murdering his wife Sajni 2 decades ago on Valentine's Day in 2003. Now, this was the second time Tarun was taken into custody. He was first arrested 5 years ago in November 2018 after being on the run for 15 years. He was then sent to Sabarmati Central Jail, where he spent the next 5 years as an under trial.
So, Tarun, very, very objectively speaking, he has been accused of murdering his wife, and there are also charges for seeking dowry. So, if we talk on a very basic level, these are the reasons why he was arrested. But the story behind his arrest is very long drawn. It involves a massive cat and mouse chase with the police.
That was the Indian Express's Sohini Ghosh, who reports from Ahmedabad for the paper. And like she mentioned, the story spans over 2 decades. It began when Tarun's wife Sajni, a bank employee, was found dead at their home in Ahmedabad on Valentine's Day in 2003.
Now, what happened immediately after was Tarun called Sajni's parents, said that it seems to be a burglary case here that has happened in our house. So, this was the first panic call that went.
But when the police arrived at the crime scene, they quickly started to suspect Tarun's story about a burglary. When Sohini spoke to some of the police officials who investigated Sajni's murder, they said there was clearly something amiss. Here she tells us what they saw that day.
So the police noticed that the whole room was ransacked, the cupboards were ransacked, but there was jewelry lying around, there was cash lying around, and Tarun was apparently in a state of shock. He apparently soon fainted, and the next day he had gotten himself admitted in a hospital, public health facility near their home. So this is how the scene sets. And initially the police did think that this is probably a burglary. A FIR was lodged at Sarkhej police station back then. And accordingly the due process was followed. However, just to cover all their bases, all the grounds, the police called Tarun to appear before at the police station and get his statement recorded. A very normal process otherwise in case of any sort of crime.
But when Tarun failed to appear at the police station to record his statement, the police realized there was more to the story.
And soon police realized that he is nowhere to be found. They tracked the whereabouts, they tried to see where he went, what he did, and they found out that just on February 16th, that is 2 days after the murder, and 1 day after Sajni's last rites were performed, he had withdrawn cash of around rupees 30,000 from Sajni's account. And then there was no trail to follow for the police.
The police later discovered that Tarun had taken a train to Surat after withdrawing the money. When officials started investigating the case and piecing together what had really happened, they learned that Tarun was having an extramarital affair. In fact, when he arrived in Surat, the first call he made was to his girlfriend. But things didn't go quite as planned.
The police hypothesis goes that one of the motives behind murdering Sajni for Tarun was to remove a supposed thorn in their love story, the girlfriend and Tarun's love story. So he calls up then girlfriend and tells her that I have removed the thorn from our path. And then girlfriend is completely shocked and she practically cuts off all ties. She says that I cannot be with someone who's doing this. And that's where the love affair chapter closes. So now Tarun is wondering what to do.
With no way of returning to Ahmedabad, Tarun decided to make a fresh start in Bengaluru. Here he quickly figured out he would need an all-new identity. And after some research, he figured that his college senior, Praveen Bhatle, perfectly fit the bill.
So Praveen Bhatle was a college senior of his in Gwalior. So it was not a very close friendship, but it was a bit above acquaintance. And he wanted someone like that because he wanted someone who would not be clued into his personal life. So someone who did not know that he was married, someone who did not know that he's now a murder suspect.
So Tarun applied for jobs as Praveen Bhatle and even managed to land a call center gig in New Delhi. But when he wasn't able to produce any sort of documentation, he landed up at the real Praveen Bhartle's doorstep in Bhopal.
He goes there in April, tells him that, hey, I'm unemployed currently. I had a tiff with my old employer. He portrayed himself to be a teacher. He was actually a basketball teacher. And using that pretext, he asks for a job from Praveen. Praveen unsuspectingly agrees. He was running a coaching center of sorts back then, where they were teaching underprivileged children. And that's where Praveen fixed his employment. Praveen told him that, hey, you speak really good English, you are fluent, so teach them spoken English. He starts teaching spoken English.
While working at Praveen's institute, Tarun had access to all employee documents, including Praveen's himself.
And this was a ripe opportunity. So Tarun takes those documents, gets them photoshopped with his own images, which includes identity cards and mark sheets. And now his transformation is kind of complete because there's a photo of the original Tarun Jinraj, but the name identifying that photo is Praveen Bhartle.
And now that he managed to get his documents in order, Tarun quit the job and moved back to New Delhi. Here he managed to rise the ranks pretty quickly at several jobs at IT firms and call centers. In 2008, he was employed at a US-based IT firm. And when they decided to set up shop in Pune, they thought Tarun was the man for the job. He relocated to Pune, and that was when he met a woman named Nisha Menon, who he would later end up marrying.
So 2008, he's in Pune with Nisha, and while the romance is blooming over there, he tells her that I am an orphan, I don't have parents, and they were killed in a road accident. I was brought up by a auntie of sorts, and this auntie's name, he says it's Anamma Chako, who's based in Mandsaur.
But in reality, Anamma Chako is Tarun's biological mother. And according to the police, she had continued to support him both emotionally and financially over the years. Like Sohini mentioned, Tarun introduced Anamma to Nisha as his aunt who raised him. And after he convinces her of his backstory, Tarun marries Nisha a year later in 2009.
And soon after, in 2010, she's pregnant and they both decide to move back to Bangalore, where Nisha's parents are based. So they move back to Bangalore, they start living a life, they have 2 kids eventually.
In the meantime, the murder case against Tarun was shelved.
Because practically, Tarun Jinraj had stopped existing. He was existing as Praveen Bhartle. So the police trail ran cold, they kind of gave up, and the case was in the shelf for the longest time.
However, Sajni's parents continued to push for the investigation to be reopened. In fact, at one point, they even met with then Gujarat Chief Minister Narendra Modi. And finally, the Gujarat police decided to look at the case afresh. A team of 18 police personnel from the crime branch was set up to trace Tarun. With few fresh leads, the police decided they would start with Tarun's mother Anamma in Mandsaur.
So the police went in disguise. They posed as business persons who have to recover money in the area of Mandsaur in Madhya Pradesh. And Anamma's house was in Mandsaur. So the police went to her, asked whether they can take up on rent the floor above hers. And she agreed. And they kind of practically were sharing a wall during surveillance, the police and Anamma. Despite the physical closeness, the police was again ending up with dead ends.
When the police inquired about Anamma's children, she claimed that one was in Ahmedabad and the other was dead. But when they spoke to Anamma's neighbors, they said they were told that Anamma's second son was somewhere in South India.
Eventually then, for the police, this became a clue. So they started going through Anamma's Facebook profile as well and looking for connections that probably lead to someone in southern part of India. They obviously could not find anyone named Tarun Jinraj in her friend list. But they found two people. One was a certain spiritual organization where Anamma's husband had gone before his death. And a second one was of a person called Nisha Menon, who seemed to be based in Bangalore.
The police then started to investigate Nisha, who, as we mentioned before, is Tarun's second wife. Around this time, the police also learned that Anamma was getting regular late-night calls from a customer care number registered to a tech company in Bengaluru. And so, a police team landed up at the tech company Oracle's office in Bengaluru.
They went, they asked for a Tarun Jinraj. There was no Tarun Jinraj. So, they started tracking Nisha's calls and they realized that the person who was her husband was one Praveen Bhatle. So then they asked at the Oracle office for a certain Praveen Bhatle. And turns out when the office folks led the police to Praveen Bhatle, it was indeed Tarun.
This was when the police came face to face with Tarun after 15 years. Here, Sohini describes the scene.
So the police, in a very dramatic fashion, always recounts that one of the key identifiers of Tarun was his right hand's ring finger. So the ring finger was stiff because of a prior basketball injury. So police, when they saw the now Praveen Bhatle come Tarun Jinraj, it was difficult to identify physically because there had been a lot of changes over the years in terms of his look, physique, etc. So the police made this device where they shook Praveen Bhatle's hand and the straight confirmation was immediately when the finger stuck out. And that's when another cop who was standing beside Tarun Jinraj, Praveen Bhatle, called him out as Tarun and he turned back. And that was a second confirmation for the police.
And so Tarun ended up at Sabarmati jail for the first time in 2018 after being on the run for 15 years. Soon after his arrest, he also started applying for bail, citing various reasons like his mother's sickness or her poor financial condition. And in the 4 years that he spent in jail, Tarun had applied for bail 16 times. He was finally granted temporary bail last year in October for a period of 10 days. He promptly returned to the prison after the 10-day period lapsed. And in July this year, he applied again. Based on his good behavior and the fact that he had reported back last time, the court agreed to grant him bail for 2 weeks. And so on August 4th, Tarun walked out of jail on bail. He was meant to return on August 19th, but didn't.
The Ahmedabad police formed a team of officials from various departments and they started looking around. Eventually, on October 5, that is almost 6 weeks since he was supposed to report back to jail, he was traced to Delhi.
However, this time as well, he had assumed a new identity. He went by Justin Joseph.
There's a backstory to the Justin Joseph identity. In jail, you find a lot of people, and he realized that there's a way out of the jail by forging a new identity. And he found the people. There's apparently a very well-oiled machinery working inside and outside the jail to do this work. So he found someone who could provide him with a fake Aadhaar card where the name is shown as Justin Joseph.
And now with this new identity, he traveled to many cities, partied around, landed a job and got a dragon tattoo on his arm. He even planned to get a hair transplant, but things didn't quite work out for him this time around.
They practically caught him from the hair transplant clinic where he was there for an appointment. Now, the police at this point is not at all talking about whether it was human intelligence, whether it was some digital footprint. According to them, it was a combination of both. And it is possible because although he did not have a mobile phone, I think he was accessing a laptop or a computer device because he was on OkCupid already and apparently chatting to more than one woman. So yeah, he's now back in Sabarmati jail, and the police says that they are simultaneously investigating this entire network of prisoners, ex-prisoners under trials who work for providing fake documents or an escape plan for under trials and convicts.
And in the end, we talk about the Asian Games. In this year's Asian Games, which concluded yesterday, India managed to cross their target of winning more than 100 medals. The 600 plus Indian contingent managed to win a record 107 medals, which also included 35 gold medals, making this the country's best performance in an Asian Games. When we spoke to the Indian Express's Amit Kamath, he told us these wins hold a lot of significance for India.
Before this, India had only ever crossed 100 medals, I think, at the Commonwealth Games, which India had hosted. So to go and win 100 medals, that too in China, is a significant moment for sure. I mean, you only have to look at the last best ever medals tally at an Asian Games was 70 medals last time around. So to have over 100 medals this time is like almost a 1/3 a spike in medals. So that is significant in a sense.
But what stood out to Amit is that the Indian contingent managed to win medals in unexpected sports.
Like roller skating was one, canoeing was one. We had I believe, a Sapak Takraw medal, things like that. I mean, golf was one of those medals, right? A silver in golf. And not to forget that Aditi was actually leading going into the final day. So it could have actually been a gold medal, not just a silver. You know what other things stood out? Like Jyoti Araji, who won a silver medal in the 110-meter hurdles sprint. After the race, while talking, she said, I would like to apologize to India for winning a silver medal. And I mean, she doesn't have anything to apologize about, but the whole point is that the mindset has changed so much that athletes are now apologizing for silver, which they now consider a defeat. Earlier, athletes would go there and think, acha chalo, getting to the Asian Games was, competing at the Asian Games was their thing. For a lot of Indian athletes, it was about exposure. All these big ticket events was the one time when the government would spend money to send these guys out. So then that would be there. Maybe one time they would probably go outside. Now what is happening is a lot of these athletes are anyway sent out for exposure camps, competitions, not just the Asian Games and the once in 4-year events. So those are the kind of things that have stood out for me.
And Amit also says that many new players managed to win a medal this time as well.
Like shooting last time around had 9 medals. None of them have medaled at this time around. So all of our shooting medals have come from somebody who is completely new. Same with a sport like wrestling.
Now, Amit says that a lot of the success can be attributed to India's continuous efforts and fundings in ensuring the best possible training for its sportspersons.
I mean, you just look at the amount of money that has gone into a sport like archery, right? And archery is something that we've had high hopes for at the Olympics in 2012 when we had the first pang of disappointment at London in archery. And since then, we've always, thought that maybe archer can win a medal, but that has never happened. But despite that, you look at the funding that has gone into archery in 2022 and 23 from the government. It is around, I believe, 24 crores. And a lot of things have been going in the background. Like you hired coaches from maybe South Korea, you had coaches coming in from Italy, you had the best of sports science that you can probably give them. You had neuroscience experts coming in from USA. Not just that, we've also tried to put in effort into the next line of coaches. Like the next 50 or odd coaches that are there, not just the national coaches, they've also been given some sort of exposure in terms of going and training abroad for very short stints or going to conferences abroad to learn the best practices, things like that.
And this effort and funding by the government has paid dividends. Archery, which had won 2 medals in the last Asian Games in 2018, managed to scoop up 9 medals this year. Here, Amit adds that now the Asian Games is over, the Indian contingent will have to look forward to the Paris Olympics scheduled for next year.
But we have to keep that perspective in mind that when you go to an Olympics, the stage, the level of competitors are just so much more bigger than when you go to a Asian Games. Your competitors will be much stronger. So all of that things have to be kept in mind.
Here, Amit gives an example of the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee and says that India needs to take a leaf out of their book to keep its win streak alive during the Paris Olympics.
So the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee they are in charge of Team USA Olympic team, right? And the Paralympic team. And over the last many Olympics, USA is the country that always dominates the medals table. But what happens after they go back? After they go back, the US Olympic Committee again sits down with a whole tally of kahan pe jeeta, kahan pe miss kiya, what could we do in those sports jahan pe miss kiya, and what should we do better in the events that we've still won a gold at. So that is something that now needs to happen. We can't just be very, very satisfied ki acha chalo 107 aa gaye and all of that. The next step is to see how we can build up on that. Who are the guys jinka yahan pe shayad silver medal आया या bronze medal आया? Can we maybe give them a push, or can we give them whatever they want in the last mile to the Paris Olympics cycle?
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. It was written and produced by me, Rahel, Philipose, Utsa, Sarmin and Shashank. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone who you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcast and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.